All right, in our last hour today, we want to talk about and look into evidence for the existence of Israelites in Egypt during the time of the 430-year sojourn, right? So, and I really need to introduce, to preface it with something very important. I don't have the time to persuade you about all of the evidence I'm showing you. In other words, my goal can't be, just because of raw time, my goal won't be to persuade you of every little item that acts as evidence. If I could, I would, but the good news is my book does that for me. Because there's unlimited time, right? For you to be able to read the book, for me to be able to write the book. You to read it, for me to write it. So that's where the evidence will be proven per se, where I try to prove that to the reader, not just assume it. But here how I will assume it. So I do know that there are several of you here who weren't here for the morning session. So because of that, I want to make sure that I point this out to those of you who are new this afternoon. There are two different books of mine, my second book and my third book, in the back. I don't know how many copies are left of each, but the closer we can get to getting all of those sold out, the better. So if you would like a copy, you haven't got one yet, I would love to sign it for you. So at the end of my session today, this afternoon, I will be in the back to sign copies of my book that you may purchase. So if you're interested and you haven't done so, you're welcome to do that. All right. I think that's all that I want. Oh, one other thing. When I'm finished, Dr. Thurman will come up and close things. So don't just walk out when I say thank you. Hang on there another minute or two. And then as he's finishing things, I will be heading to the back. All right. So I'm mainly going to be focusing on evidence for Israelites in Egypt in Joseph's day. I had 3 time periods I could focus on. One would be that. Second would be coming now toward all the way to the end of the sojourn and at Moses' day. I'm not really focusing on that. That's in the book. And I'm not focusing on the interim, the period between the two, which is basically around 1800 BC-ish to 1500 BC-ish, that range. There's not as much of that evidence, even though the time period's the biggest for the middle one. The time period, the amount of evidence is much more limited. The majority of the evidence is Joseph's day. Second of the 3 majority-wise would be Moses' day, but we're just going to be looking at the evidence for Joseph's day. And again, all of this is found in my book, Origins of the Hebrews, New Evidence for Israelites in Egypt, From Joseph to the Exodus, 2021, published by New Creation from Nashville. And by the way, I'll just mention this since it came to mind. In follow-up to what I said this morning, I literally sought after, I approached many different publishers when I sought after a publisher to publish my book. Well-known, reputed publishers, both secular and Christian. And I learned a lot from that process, by the way. This includes presses like Princeton and Harvard and other very, very, maybe Oxford. I forget if I went to Oxford or not. And then in the Christian realm, a lot of the publishers that are in, especially Michigan. Michigan has a ton of publishers. And what I learned is we really need to redefine what a Christian publisher means. It's true. When they heard, when they read, when they considered my proposal that the Exodus actually happens in the 15th century BC, that cut me off with a lot of the, especially Christian publishers, because that doesn't fit their framework for the majority of Christian scholarship, right? And it's not about the evidence, it's not about the facts, it's about, contending with the standard view or going with it. The standard view has no evidence. Nobody has published a book with evidence for the late Exodus view of the 13th century BC. Nobody. Now, flip side, nobody's published a book on 15th century evidence until this book. This is the first book ever. To my knowledge, still the only book published with evidence of Israelites in Egypt. Archaeological, physical, historical, and epigraphical evidence. But that's where you stand if you stand up for the literal interpretation of the inspired Word of God sometimes. So the publisher for this is, okay, how many of you have seen Is Genesis History? Okay, many of you. The people behind Is Genesis History, and it's mainly one guy. He's amazing. Thomas Purifoy. I don't know if you know of Thomas or not. Amazing, amazing person. Genius. He doesn't even have an advanced degree. And he's smarter than many people with PhDs. He decided, for those of us who were in Is Genesis History, who lost the opportunity because of that film, because of our presence in the film, we lost the chance to use publishers that are standard publishers. He decided, I'm going to start a publishing house, quote-unquote publishing house, for those of you whom I handicapped. And so, as I looked and looked, and I think there were 14 or 15 publishers that turned down my book. Finally, I was just frustrated, and I was in a conversation with Thomas, and I said, Thomas, I don't know what to do. Can't find a publisher. This is, I think, and call me assuming too much of my own work, but I think this is great material. I think this is a no-brainer. And he said, well, and that's when he told me that he had just started this publishing house. So I published through him, his creation of this publisher. So that's origins of the Hebrew and a little bit of the inside behind it. And there's much more story there that I'm missing on. All right, so as I mentioned in the beginning of my first session, you need to get the chronology of the Israelites correct. You need to get the chronology of the Egyptians correct, and you need to synchronize them correctly. Otherwise, all you're talking about is pin the tail on the donkey. Maybe you'll get it blindfolded. Probably you won't. So a lot of the evidence, the alleged evidence out there from people like, has anybody heard of the name David Rohl? Okay, not many, just a couple. People like David Rohl and others, they propose evidence for connections between the Israelites and the Egyptians that's not based on careful work of Israelite chronology and Egyptian chronology, and they're willing to take steps that go beyond that, just compromise what we've learned over 200 years of study in both fields. They're willing to throw that all away to try to make alleged connections because certain pieces of evidence seem like they connect with something in the Bible. That is a bad practice. That's terrible methodology. But it goes on. So you have to get it right. So just a couple of moments on the chronology and the relevant connections. Now, genealogical tree-wise, you know that Abram, who becomes Abraham, has a lineage that's connected to the chosen people of God through his son Isaac. Now, he also had, I'm going to have to hopefully get the laser pointer. There we go. He also had Ishmael and other children, of course. Ishmael was the firstborn, but of course was not the son of promise. God's revelation to Abram would be that his son through Sarai, who becomes Sarah, would be the son of promise. That's Isaac. So the line goes through him. Isaac has his own children, Esau being the oldest son, Jacob being the younger son. Jacob is the one who received the connection with the promised line of God. Esau's rejected. Ishmael's rejected. Jacob has 12 sons. All of them are included. So it's every descendant, physical descendant of Jacob through his wives and ladies who are a part of this lineage, this promised line. One of Jacob's sons, and of course Jacob becomes Israel, so you have name changes going on all over the place, or name additions or changes. That's very common. That's not uncommon in the ancient world, by the way. Because your name isn't one thing you receive at birth to keep for the rest of your life. That's our concept. It's not the ancient concept. What you do that distinguishes you in life is your name. And you may or may not have it for your whole life. Because maybe something comes along to distinguish you differently that gives you a different name. That's why, again, it's no problem to do this. Every Egyptian king had at least how many names? Anybody know? There's a number here. It's less than 10, more than 1. Close to 4. 5. 5 names automatically. We call this the royal titulary, or royal titles. Every king has 5 royal names. 5 names? Yeah, 5 names. So the idea of 2 names for a person? No problem. So Jacob has 12 sons of promise. One of them, of course, is Joseph. Joseph does not receive the birthright blessing, oddly enough. In fact, Reuben doesn't receive the birthright blessing from Jacob. Who can tell me who receives the birthright blessing from Jacob? Not Judah. Somebody I think said it. Ephraim, great, excellent, perfect. A grandchild receives it. How's that? Jacob himself tells us that when he was about to die and Joseph came to visit him to say goodbye to Dad, and he brought his 2 eldest sons with him, Joseph did, Manasseh the oldest, Ephraim the second oldest. They stood before Jacob, and Jacob chose Ephraim the second-born to be the recipient of the birthright blessing. We're going to see a little bit of the remnant of that choice today. So here they are, Manasseh and Ephraim. Those 2. And they're probably born at Lahun. I can't say that with certainty, but high likelihood, because the first place Joseph went after his elevation to second in command in Egypt was Lahun. And probably he had his children there. All right. Then timing-wise, chronology-wise, this is a date we saw this morning. 1876 is the correct year according to biblical chronology when Jacob and his family would have entered into Egypt. And I wrote an article that's connected to this, all of this, peer-reviewed article published in 2019 in Near Eastern Archaeological Society Bulletin. It's available for a free download from my academia.edu webpage. You say, well, Dr. P, how do I get that if I'm interested? Go to your computer, be online, type in your search line with your Google or whatever. Type in my name, Douglas Petrovich, space, academia.edu, enter. And that will take you, it'll give you links, and probably the first link will take you right to my academia.edu webpage, and you can find it there. In this article, I try to prove that the sojourn in Egypt takes place for 430 years, not a different number, not 215 years or any other number, but exactly 430 years. That takes you back then to 1876 BC. It's I think, a very important article in getting us there chronologically to provide that foundation that Keaton was talking about this morning. You pull out the foundation, the building falls. The foundation is chronology for ancient history. All right, let's look at a little bit more of the chronology now as we zoom in on that period of Joseph's life. So, when did Joseph have this dream? When did the king have this dream that Joseph interpreted for him? And of course, there were 2 dreams. Joseph said they're basically the same dream. It's a 2-for-1 deal. And the fact that it was 2 dreams reveals that God meant it with certainty that this will happen. It's not maybe not. It will happen. That's 1885 BC when Joseph has that dream. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's or the king's dream. 1878 is the year of two things. One, there's a transition on the throne. I didn't manipulate it this way. It just worked out this way. One king dies and another king gets onto the throne. In 1878, Sesostris II dies. He, I affectionately refer to as the abundance pharaoh because his last 7 years are equal to the 7 years of abundance in Egypt, oddly enough. In that same year when it ends, he dies. Second occurrence in that year is this transition from the abundance to the 7 years of famine that God promised. Remember, the fat cows that come first, they represent that period of abundance where you're storing up all of the extra grain in Egypt, and it can then be in the bank for you for the 7 years of famine, because in the 7 years of famine, it will get so bad, you'll forget about the abundance. So that transition takes place in the year that Sesostris II dies, probably suddenly, and I say probably because, number one, we don't know, but number two, we don't have any physical evidence of what we call a co-regency, where they're ruling, overlapping at the same time. That's typically a common occurrence, a co-regency, during the 12th dynasty, but we don't see it. We don't have evidence for it from Sesostris II to III. So probably Sesostris II dies unexpectedly, suddenly, and then boom, his son Sesostris III is coronated, and he gets onto the throne right away. 1876, we know that. That's the year Jacob enters Egypt, so that's 2 years later. And then 1859. Now, for our purposes, I highlight this because these two last dates become really important for what we're looking at with the archaeological evidence. 1859. Two things very important happen in that year. Number one, there's another transition on the throne, and here we do have a co-regency. Sesostris III decides, I'm going to put my son, my heir, whom we know as Amenemhat III, I will put him on the throne with me. And we'll co-rule. Now, the way this works is, and for those of you who, as I am, are in the older stage of life, you know what this is all about, right? As you age, you get faster, you slow down, you move toward retirement. So this decision, in many cases, to put your son, your heir, on the throne, coincides with your choice to move into retirement or semi-retirement. So probably Sesostris III really started honing that golf game right around this time he passes the baton. And the other important thing to note about this is this. Of the two kings, the older or the younger, the father or the son usually, it's the son who does all the practical rule because the father's busy starting his retirement. So the son has all the energy, he has the youth to go with it. He's the one who sits on the throne, who listens to the complaints of people and the issues and hears the ambassadors and makes the decisions. All of that is the new co-regent at work. So the second thing that happens in 1859 is that Jacob dies. Now, I don't know which of these two events happens first, but my guess, strictly a guess, so that I'm not, don't hold me to this. My guess is that Jacob would have died, and Sesostris III, the famine pharaoh, whom I affectionately refer to as the famine pharaoh, Sesostris III, he saw this, right? And he has this bond with Joseph and that whole family. He saw this. He kind of looked around and he said, maybe looked in the mirror and said, my hair's getting a little bit gray. It's about time that I move on in life. So possibly Jacob's death influences the king to bring his son on as his co-regent so that he can, again, get to the golf course and start working on that front nine. So those two things happen in 1859. 1842 BC. Now, I didn't have time this morning. I wanted to talk through with you Sinai 1:15, which is a very important inscription that mentions Hebrews literally by name. It's one of the inscriptions that was preserved at Serebit el-Khadim, this place where we talked about where the Egyptians occasionally would go on these mining expeditions to extract turquoise for this lucrative industry. So I didn't get to talk about it, but Sinai 1:15 reads like this at the bottom. So it's like, okay, it's a piece of stone that was carved, an inscription carved in it. It looks like a tombstone. You remember the 19th century tombstones? They have that half-moon shape and they go down. It looks like a really tall 19th century tombstone. And from top to bottom, it's a description of all of the events related to that campaign, that expedition, that year. Then at the very bottom, when one author, one composer, during his trips down there named Chebeded, he perpetually draws this picture at the bottom, and then he typically writes something above it as a caption. And it just so happens that one of the last inscriptions that one of the last of the stelae that he composes, so one of the final years he goes there, its caption reads 6 Levantines. And by Levantine, I mean a person who lives in the Levant. Our word Lebanon in English comes from that word, the Levant. What's the Levant? So ancient Canaan, right? Canaan. So there's Canaan here, that's the southern Levant, and then there's the northern Levant. And the northern Levant includes the strip over here, that's Phoenicia, and then all of this area up here, Syria. So Phoenicia and Syria is the northern Levant. All of those three together in the ancient world, we call that the Levant in ancient history and archaeology and Egyptology, right? So it reads six Levantines, 6 people from the Levant, and then in apposition, you can put a colon there in English, it says Hebrews of Bethel the beloved, meaning Bethel's beloved. Why would Bethel be beloved? Somebody tell me. Yeah. What major event happened there? Jacob met God at Bethel. And therefore, the name of the city is House of God, right? Literally, though, in Canaanite thought, it's house of the king of the gods. That's what it means. El was the king of the gods. Not just any god, he was the king of the gods. And Moses ends up using this. Did you know that? Moses uses a Canaanite term. Sacrilegious, right? Why? Because of the connotation between El and the king of the gods. Like Zeus, if it's the Greek pantheon. So Sinai 1:15 is very important because it's the oldest reference we have to a term for the Hebrew people, for the Israelites, using the term Hebrews, not Israelites. And of course that makes sense because Jacob is the first Israelite, isn't he? We don't really have the Israelites in the 19th century BC, or at least they don't go by the term Israelites, they go by the Hebrews. Who's the first Hebrew we know of in the Bible? Nope, not Jacob. Abram. When he's introduced, go back and look at this yourself in Genesis. When Moses introduces Abraham, he calls him Abram the Hebrew. He's the first of the Hebrews. What does that mean? Hebrews are not just descendants of Jacob. Abram already is a Hebrew, so what do we have going back from before Abram? What are they? Hebrews. Surprise. Right? So that's why it says Hebrews, because they are all Hebrews. In Akkadian, we have a word for this. It's Habiru. Have you heard that before? Habiru, that's the same term that's used of Hebrews. Now, is every Habiru an Abramite? a descendant of Abram? No. No. Now, I don't know that the lineage of the non-Abrahamic Hebrews or Habiru, I don't know that they go down as far in history. They probably mostly die off before they get as far as the Israelites do, but that's the way it works. So 6 Levantines, Hebrews of Bethel, the beloved. It's because Bethel, why is that mentioned there, the beloved? Whoever the author is, he's talking about the lineage of someone and tying it to a city that's like a home city. For me, Akron, Ohio will always be my beloved city. That's my hometown. Won't change. Now, you may hear of Akron, Ohio, and you think LeBron James, okay? Well, I've got news for you, or Steph Curry. I've got news for you. I was born before either of them. So I claim it as my home city. Don't forget. So that's Sinai 1:15. It contains, and all of that to say, it contains something very important. And that is, well, it contains 2 non-hieroglyphs. Remember I told you there was a caption, and I just translated it for you? Most of it's written in Middle Egyptian. But we have 2 characters, two pictographs that are not Middle Egyptian hieroglyphics. And it took me the longest time to figure out what in the world's going on here. The first part of it, 6 Levantines, that was translated by, remember I told you Sir Alan Gardner was the top Egyptological language expert of the 20th century. He read that, and I don't have time to tell you the story. It's amazing that he figured that out. He was correct. 6 Levantines. He stopped translating the rest because he never figured it out. In one of the 2 words that he translates, the Levantines word, it has a Canaanite syllabic. And you say, well, Dr. P, what is a Canaanite syllabic? Good question. Well, derived from the Canaanite people. Syllabic is a fancy way of saying it represents a syllable. And in the ancient world, you have open and closed syllables. But mainly you're talking about, especially with an open syllable, 1 consonant and 1 vowel. Ba, be, bi, bo. Lu, la, le, etc., right? So the Canaanite syllabic represents the combination of a consonant and a vowel together. Gardner figured this out. Genius that he did. Incredible story that I don't have time to tell. But then in the word Hebrews that he didn't translate, that took me forever to figure out, seemed like forever, there's another non-Middle Egyptian hieroglyphic. It's not a Canaanite syllabic, though. It's a proto-consonantal letter that you saw some of those in our morning hour, right? You saw a bunch of those. And it's the house pictograph. The house pictograph. Who knows what the Hebrew word for house is? Beit is house of, technically, so that's what we call the construct form, but the absolute form is bayit. Bayit. That's the way we should be saying house, unless it's technically house of. So bayit, it's a house, makes the b sound, and actually it reads, combination of hieroglyphics and that proto-consonantal letter, it reads ivrei, Hebrews of. Mind-blowing. So whoever this guy is who writes this is connected to the Hebrews. He's one of them, and he's connected to the very Hebrews whose home city is not Akron, Ohio, Bethel. Exactly. That's their home city. And who does that connect us to? Only one person, Jacob. Nobody else. I mean, the place is like, stones and trees until Jacob has an encounter with God. And then later in life, Jacob he was there only a short time. He left. He had his family. And then God calls him to move his family to Bethel. That's when it becomes beloved Bethel for his whole family. And whoever writes this, Sinai 1:15, this caption, he's connected to it, 100%. All right, so that's my first book, The World's Oldest Alphabet. where Sinai 115 came from. And now I want to, again, for background, mention a couple things. Okay, we already talked about this. Sesostris II. He is who? He is the abundance pharaoh. He dies at the end of the 7 years of abundance. Then Sesostris III is the famine pharaoh. His rule starts when the famine begins, and he goes on to rule long after the famine. And he, by the way, is the king whom Jacob blessed. Do you remember that God blesses the king, the Egyptian king? If you study, it's amazing, and this is in my book, but if you study the biography of Sesostris III, you're amazed at how much this guy experienced. It was off the charts amazing. He becomes filthy rich. He becomes a powerful leader in Egypt that Egypt has never seen before, especially connected to the abolishment of an institution, a societal political institution known as the nomarchy. What can we connect that with? Governorship. How many states do we have? 50. How many governors do we have? 50. Governors are constantly, if you look in the news lately, they're constantly in conflict with whom? Don't say each other. Which government? National, right? So you have more local, right? You have a local leadership and you have a national leadership, and they're constantly butting heads. So the same thing happened in antiquity. There was a butting of the heads of the monarchy, the king, and the nomarchy, the nomarchs, equivalent to the governors of our world. So that conflict literally ended the old kingdom of Egypt, which we're going to be talking about in the course that I teach that you're invited to be a part of starting in August. So, with Sesostris III, with his reign, he eliminates the nomarchy. So let's put that in context, what that would look like. It's mind-blowing. Imagine, okay, I know Donald Trump gets a lot of grief from people, accusing him of this, that, and the other, and I don't even want to get into all that, but imagine that Donald Trump decides, I've had enough of the 50 governors of the United States of America. They're done. Can he get away with that? Probably not. I think there would be a popular uprising that would end Donald Trump, not the governorship in America. Probably that's what would happen. Imagine that in ancient Egypt. That's what happened. They disappear off the face of the earth, and there's no physical record of it in the annals of Egypt. How's that? You know what happens? All of a sudden, the rich nomarchs just stop building their tombs and being buried there with inscriptions that tell all about their exploits and all that they possessed. It just disappears. All the power that the governors had, the nomarchs, it went into the pocket of the king. Sesostris III. This guy, humanly speaking, is blessed like you can't believe. And it's all in the record. Okay, I'm not just making it up. Any Egyptologist who knows the Middle Kingdom or the 12th dynasty will tell you exactly what I'm telling you. All right. Amenemhat III, who is he? He is the king, the son of Sesostris III, who steps onto the throne with Sesostris III to become co-regent in 1859, the year that Jacob dies. So he's the pharaoh whose rule began in the year of Jacob's death. Then, the site that we'll look at probably today more than any other is called Avaris. In the Bible, you know of it as Ramses. I could spend the time and convince you that that's true. To save time, to devote time to other things, I won't. You could always ask me, at the end of the conference, I suppose, and I can talk you through it. But Avaris, that is the homestead of Jacob. Jacob settles at Avaris. Oddly enough, it's the number one most ancient historical site excavated in the entire ancient Near East. Go all the way to Mesopotamia, include Turkey, Sudan, Libya, the whole map of the ancient Near East. Number one most excavated site is Avaris. That's where God settled Jacob. You know who paid for the excavation there? A national government. Austria. Paid for it all. Lock, stock, and barrel. Just shelled out the, what do they use? Not francs. Whatever they use. Maybe it's the euro nowadays, I suppose, but they shelled out the money, and the digging went on. And that site gives us incredible evidence for Israelites in Egypt, especially during the lifetime of Jacob and Joseph. So stratum it basically is a fancy word for level, right? Or occupational level. Stratum D2, lowercase d, / Arabic number 2. That's the first Asiatic occupational phase out of Aris. So the archaeologists, when they started digging there, they dug down far enough to know, okay, this is where it started for Asiatics living in Egypt. And of course, the first red flag is, what are Asiatics doing in Egypt? They're supposed to be Egyptians there. Well, there was a huge community of Asiatics. Now, the secular world is not going to tell you that those were Israelites. All they'll say is they're Asiatics, and that's it. They'll leave it at that. Those are the Israelite people. The second occupational phase, and so I connect the first phase with Jacob's lifetime. Remember, he arrives in 1876, he dies in 1859. D1 is the stratum or level of the second Asiatic occupational phase, and I connect that with Ephraim and Manasseh, right? So Jacob dies, it's 1859. What happens? He's taken to Canaan, he's buried. Joseph, he still has work to do in Egypt, he's busy elsewhere. Ephraim and Manasseh move to Avaris. I don't just make that up. The Bible tells us that. And I think we're actually going to see it very, very soon. So the relevant biblical passages, just to get us acquainted with all of this, Genesis 47 and 48. Here's part of it. And this is my translation from Hebrew. I always offer my own translation. I don't offer anybody else's because I want to work as hard as I need to get it as right as I can. And it says this, beginning in verse 11 of Genesis 47. So Joseph settled his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, and the best of the land in the land of Ramesses. And again, we can superimpose Avaris for that. That's the earlier name of the site, the overall site, as Pharaoh had ordered. Now Israel, who's Israel? Jacob. Now Israel lived in the land of Egypt, in Goshen. So Goshen is kind of like, I don't know, we don't maybe have a perfect analogy in English, but in America, but maybe like the county, okay? It's like a county. So, and they acquired property in it and were fruitful and became very numerous. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. That's why I'm so confident about the dates I gave you for his arrival in Egypt and his death in 1859. Now, it came about after these things that Joseph was told, take note, your father is sick. And we can call this, he basically entered his deathbed, more or less. So he took his 2 sons, meaning Joseph, took Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, with him. Manasseh being the firstborn, right? So they are part of this journey to visit grandpa before he dies. When it was told to Jacob, look, your son Joseph has come to you. So, they can see the dust from, these travelers as they're coming from the south. And they run to Jacob and they say to him, look, here's Joseph. He's come to you. Then Israel, that is Jacob, collected his strength and sat up in the bed. Genesis 48, 3-6. Then Jacob said to Joseph, God Almighty appeared to me at Luz in the land of Canaan and blessed me. And he said to me, you see, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. And by the way, quick footnote, this is really important to the question of how long was the sojourn in Egypt, and is the 430 years spoken of in Exodus 12, 40, and 41 just Egypt, or is it Egypt and Canaan? This is really important to that because in Galatians 3, when there is a reference to those 430 years, there are different tent pegs that are used for the beginning of that 430 years and the end of it. The beginning of it was the final promise connected to the Abrahamic covenant, the final promise given to one of Abram's heirs that this is their land. And it literally says in Greek that it's a singular seed, and I'm not talking about Jesus here. This isn't the Jesus seed part of it. It says that the promise was made to a singular seed. Which seeds do we have to work with? Well, Abram has Isaac, and he has Jacob, and then we go to Ephraim or whatever, right? Or the sons of Jacob. That's all we have to work with. Who gets the final offering or giving of the Abrahamic covenant? Right here, Jacob. This is the number one, final, very final promise that's a reiteration of the Abrahamic covenant to a singular seed of Abram. Right there. So the 430 years in Galatians has to start at the moment that Jacob, that in the year that Jacob, two things happen with Jacob. Number one, he receives this promise from God. This is before he leaves Canaan. And in that same year, he enters Egypt. That's the beginning, tent peg. And then the giving of the law is the other tent peg. So 430 years later, in the same year that you have the Exodus, what happens? Moses receives the law. What do you know? Those are the tent pegs. It's literal 430 years in Egypt, and in Egypt alone. So the textual variants in Exodus 12:40 and 41 that suggests that it's Egypt and Canaan, no. And I prove this, I think, unequivocally in my 2019 journal article. Okay, that's a side note. So, I will make you fruitful and numerous, and I will make you a company of peoples, and will give this land to your descendants after you for an everlasting possession. Now, and here's where our purpose comes into play in blue here. Your two sons, Jacob speaking to Joseph, your two sons who were born to you in the land of Egypt before I came to you in Egypt in 1876 BC, are mine. There you have it, right there. Folks, I used to think that this message given to Joseph about Joseph's two oldest sons was a plaque on the wall. That this only will come into play when the Israelites move into Canaan, the promised land, and they disperse the territory among the tribes. That's what I used to think. That it's all futuristic. Baloney. My view was dead wrong. He's talking about thievery. I'm taking, Jacob speaking, I'm taking your two oldest sons from you and saying they must now live among their uncles. Right? What does it go on to say? Ephraim and Manasseh will be mine, as Reuben and Simeon are, but your offspring that have been born after them will be yours. They will be called by the names of their brothers in the inheritance. So all of a sudden, the other sons of Jacob are now on par with Ephraim and Manasseh, or the other way around. Ephraim and Manasseh are on par with them. When Jacob says they are mine, that was his signal that they are moving to Avaris. Now, maybe that sounds a little radical to you. It doesn't sound radical to me at all. You know why? I'm an Easterner. On the outside, I look like a Westerner. I talk like a Westerner. Talk like a normal, everyday, average American. Inside, I'm not a Westerner. I'm an Easterner. I'm Serbian. My parents come from a Serbian community. I know what it's like to be an Easterner, okay? In the East, the patriarch calls the shots, if he's still alive. It doesn't matter how old or young he is or you are. If you're in your 60s and your father's still alive, you do what he says. When my father lost his job in Ohio in 1982, in 1982, and he moved to California, I was about ready to finish my senior year of high school, and my father moved in with his parents, who were in the LA area, and when he found a job there, first thing he did, the first check that he received, he handed it to my grandparents, to my grandfather. Handed him the check and said, "Give me what you don't need." Now, think of the picture here. My mom and I and my younger brother and my sister's at Ohio State, but the rest of us, we all need to survive. And it's my dad's paycheck that's the main financial supply of my family's needs, right? And yet my father hands the paycheck to his father because he's living under him now. You don't get that if you're a Westerner, probably. If you're an Easterner, that's easy peasy lemon squeezy stuff. That's how the East works. You do what you're told by the patriarch. Jacob steals Ephraim and Manasseh. That's what happens. Steals. They're gone. There it is. All right, let's talk about the residence of Jacob's family in Egypt. This is looking at Avaris. We're going to look at some excavations and maps that are there. So where is Avaris? I've got an arrow pointing to it right here. It's on the eastern edge of what's called the Nile Delta. Why is it a delta? It's a triangle. The triangle is essentially the shape of a capital delta in Greek. So the capital D, or delta, looks like a triangle, so that's called the delta. That's where Avaris is. And by the way, this was strategically positioned such that the Israelites are in the optimal place they can be in the ancient world, at least in Africa. There's no better place in all of Africa in ancient history than right there. Why? It's the bridge with Asia. What is that going to do for you? Okay? You are the middleman. People come in and out. People bring goods to you, sell them to you. You resell them. Life is easy. That's what the Israelites did. And they, from what I know of the evidence, there were two main industries that became lucrative to them. One we've already seen signs of, the turquoise mining business, right? It's a gem, right? And two is the selling and then distribution of a commodity. Anybody know what that commodity is? I'll give you a hint. It's a liquid. Wine. It's estimated that 2 million barrels of wine came into Egypt from Canaan. Because in the southern Levant, especially, the Levant overall, but especially the southern Levant, winemaking was one of their main, if not their number one main, money-making industries. So, that's Avaris. So, it's about 165 hectares. In ancient times, that's a very big number. It may not seem like a lot to you. It's a huge city. None bigger. About 65 kilometers northeast of Cairo. And it controlled all of the traffic, two ways, by sea and by land. So there's a term in the Bible that's used, it's the way of the Philistines. Have you heard that term before? God told the Israelites at the time after the Exodus, they're not to go by the way of the Philistines because they'll see war, they'll see their enemies dressed up in war garments, and they'll freak out and they'll not want to go into Canaan. So God sent them a different way. That road, the way of the Philistines, in Old Testament times it's known as the Great Trunk Road. In New Testament times it's known as the Via Maris. Via, the way, Maris, the sea, the way of the sea. So as it goes down into Africa, it curves around that southeastern part of the tongue-looking shape of the Mediterranean Sea. And the road continues in Egyptian land, and it has a new name in Egypt. It's known as the Way of Horus, the road of the king of the gods. Horus was the king of the gods in the Egyptian pantheon. So that's what they called the road there. So that road led through, right? It led right along through here, and it ended at Avaris. Now you're fully 100% in Egypt, in the heart of Egypt. The beginning of the heart of Egypt, if you will. So there are tributaries of the Nile then that can distribute goods. You can take them upstream and get to the cities of up all the way into Upper Egypt. So this is Lower Egypt, Middle Egypt, and Upper Egypt. Remember I talked about Lahoun? that's where Joseph settles first. That's where he settles. Why? Lahun at the time, in the 12th dynasty, Joseph's lifetime, it was a ghost town. Nobody lived there anymore. They hadn't lived there for hundreds of years. They all of a sudden, out of nowhere, decide, we're going to rebuild this city. It's during the reign of Sesostris II, who is the what pharaoh? Abundance pharaoh, right? Why would you turn the ghost town into a city that, by the way, Sesostris II was buried there, and this is a really important connection. The number one most important element in the job description of a vizier, second in command in Egypt, was to build the pyramidal city of his king. Number one. So, who would have been at Lahun building Sesostris II's pyramid and pyramidal city? Joseph. Joseph. That's where he goes. Why? Look at this. You see this here? That's a body of water. Lake Moeris is what it's called. Nowadays, it's salt. It's a salty lake. It used to be in antiquity that it was fresh water, but it's changed over time. What they did, a stroke of genius, and this had to be God working with Joseph, through Joseph, they built a dike, a massive dike at Lahun to reroute water that, okay, remember which direction does the Nile River flow? South to north. So the Nile flows like this. Right about here, close to Asyut, all of a sudden there is a branch off of the Nile. Anybody hear of that before? It's called the Bar Yusuf. And that Bar Yusuf flows more or less parallel to the Nile, and it keeps going and going and going. And right at Lahun, what they decided to do is reroute that Bar Yusuf water westward into the plain, and they used it to irrigate the plain, and it became the breadbasket of Egypt. It was that way all the way until the 20th century. The breadbasket of Egypt. And probably even today, it produces a lot of grain, but not as much as in antiquity. And even in the days of the Roman Empire, the Romans depended upon the food, the grain that was grown in the Fayum. The Fayum is this area that they irrigated. So all of this is the work of Joseph. And again, all of that's documented in my book, but we really won't go into it much here. But we're looking at this site, Avaris. And by the way, this is the main part of ancient Avaris in Joseph's day and in the succeeding several centuries. This right here, it's called Kantir. So this is old Avaris, if you will. This is Kantir. That is Ramesses. So the Ramesside kings, beginning under Ramses II in the 13th century BC, they build up this northeastern section and turn it into a new capital city. That's what's recorded in the Bible. It's what we call an anachronism, meaning that the term in the Bible was almost certainly, the original term was replaced with a modern update. This is a principle called scribal updating. There's a very important journal article that was published by one of the Master's Seminary professors years ago, Michael Grisanti, on textual updating. And he gives lots of different examples in the Hebrew Bible of textual updating to make it modernized, where scribes will literally take out an old word and put in a new word. Now, you can call that cheating all you want. I don't care. It doesn't bother me one bit. But that's what they did. This is one of those updates. All right, so zooming in now, Old Avaris. So our focus is on two places. Here, that's called R1. That's where the Egyptians mainly were settled. And then there's F1. This is where the Asiatics settled. Where you see dark black here, this is where excavation work took place, okay? So in all of these areas, archaeologists excavated. Here are the three main ones in F1 where the Asiatics were. There's this. Well, there's F1, there's A4, and there's A2. Those three areas. This is the one that yielded the most important evidence for the lifetime of Joseph. What does it look like more or less today? This isn't a yesterday photograph, but it's not that old. It's color. It's farmland. And most of the excavation there is done at Avaris. So if you go there today, you won't really see remnants. It really wouldn't be worth your trip. But this is where they excavated. All right, now I want to start showing you some of the fun stuff. So all the introductory work is more or less done. I want to show you what I'm convinced, and I'm not alone in this, is the residence of Jacob in Egypt. Now, precursor. For those of you who may have studied a little bit of the archaeology of Israel, you would know that there's a distinctive architectural design or type in Canaan especially, which becomes Israel, where you have 4-room houses. No other ancient culture that was living in Canaan built 4-room houses that we know of. It's really weird. So if you go into a place where there's an ancient, remnants of an ancient society, and you're in Canaan, you start excavating there, you find 4-room houses, what's the first thing you conclude? These are Israelites, exactly. 4-room house. How does that work? 1, 2, and then this central, it's usually open, right? So there's columns here. It's open, that's 3. And then here, remember we talked about Devir in the morning hour? What's Devir, the Hebrew word? Innermost room. That's the Devir, right there. That's where the person would have slept. So 4-room houses, and you're looking at an isometric drawing after 1200 BC. So we've moved forward in time just to show you an average Israelite house, right? 4-room house. Here's one at Tel Atan. 1, 2, 3, and 4. It's a 4-room house. Okay? So Israelites didn't have only 4-room houses. Here are some of their 4-room houses. So they have a modification of them, different ways of making a 4-room house. They have 3-room houses. They have 2-room houses. But the distinctive one is the 4-room house. That was seemingly kind of the most desired among most Israelites. So now we move back to Egypt. We go back earlier to Joseph's lifetime. And what do we find? There is a residence built here in the second Asiatic occupational phase, which I told you is D1, which is highlighted by all of these houses or rooms of what we would call a mansion. When the archaeologists first excavated all of this, it was so massive. They had, this was unprecedented in Egypt. They called it a palace, Palast in German. They called it a palace. Why? It's so extravagant, you'd think it has to be owned by a king. This isn't a community of royal people, though. It's not even a community of Egyptians. They're Asiatics. So to the secular archaeologist, this makes 0 sense. To this day, makes 0 sense. They don't have an answer. They may offer an answer, but it's not a good one. So that's the second occupational phase. Now, let's go back earlier. First occupational phase. What do we have here? In this area, there's some burials here that are, and they aren't really visualized as being differentiated between the first and second occupational phases, but, so you have some first phase burials, but the only building we know of is that right there. You know what that is? It's a 1, 2, 3, 4-room house. Who builds 4-room houses? Israelites. The archaeologists there know that this is Asiatic, but they won't call it Hebrew or Israelite. They won't do it. We know it is. Those of us who know better, we know that's a 4-room house. And that's almost certainly Jacob's house. Why? Well, look at this. Look where, remember the red comes first. That house is built first. So at the end of the first occupational phase, who dies? Jacob. Jacob dies, 1859. He's gone. Who lives there after him? As I told you at least. Ephraim and Manasseh lived there. How many brothers? Now, they represent how many brothers of Joseph's household? 2. only two. Two brothers built right over top. So Jacob's house is destroyed. It's wiped away. Built right over top of Jacob's house are 1, 2, or twin master bedrooms. Twin master bedrooms. Who in the world would build 2 master bedrooms? Makes no sense. But if they're the 2 brothers, the sons of Jacob, it makes perfect sense. So there it is, and you can see here with this drawing, a protective wall is built around the area. So there's a courtyard here. This is a chatzer in Hebrew, a courtyard. So there's the house in the courtyard. What was in the courtyard, we don't know. Did they grow plants there? Were there kids running around there? Were there animals pinned in there? We don't really know, but it was a courtyard. Now, you may say, well, Dr. P, how do you know to connect this to the Israelites? Maybe it's just a happenstance that it would be a 4-room house that was built there in the 19th century BC. Well, then explain this. In the later occupational phases after the 19th century BC, so in this phase, 1730 to 1700 BC, what do we have? Well, we have other houses like a 3-room house here and whatnot, but here we have a 1, 2, 3, 4-room house. Here we have a 1, 2, 3, 4-room house. We have the continuation of the same culture that had been there since the 19th century BC. The next occupational phase, 1668 to 1640, what do we have? 4-room house. 4-room house. They continue. These are Israelites continuing to live in Egypt from the 19th century to the 15th century BC, just as the Bible would have us believe. All right, the Egyptianized Asiatic residents of Ephraim and Manasseh, it's right here, F1. Here, this shows you the color differentiation of the burials. So in green, we have Jacob's lifetime. Those are all burials of Jacob's lifetime. And then Ephraim and Manasseh's occupational phase, the second phase, it's this purplish color. So all of these are the tombs of the people that outlive Jacob. And I submit to you that that's Ephraim and Manasseh and others. So I want you to see something, though, here. This is looking at part of the foundational level, what the archaeologists discovered. And, you know, there's only usually inches of foundational level that we can get, if at all, when we excavate. So they really did get a nice sampling here of the remnants of this building. Okay, the tomb of Ephraim, who's known in Egyptian as Di Sobek Em Chat. So I submit to you that one of these burials of the second occupational phase is the very burial of Ephraim himself. And you say, well, Dr. P, how do you know that? Let me show you, again, not fully proving, but show you. So this is the tomb of a guy named Sobek Em Chat. How do we know that's the guy's named Sobek Em Chat? So here's the tomb. It's tomb F1, M18, grave 3. There it is, Grab 3, so grave 3 in German. Here's where the people are buried. They bury animals here. They have donkeys buried here, and goats here. In fact, they had 5 sheep and goats buried there, 3 donkeys buried there. Now, oddly enough, when we read the Genesis account of the traveling of Jacob and his family, what do we see that they have? Donkeys, sheep, and goats, oddly enough. But we want to look at the actual burial. So what you're seeing right now is the superstructure collapse. So that's basically the ceiling or the roof that falls down on the structure. But if we pull away the roof, here's what we see. There are 4 burial chambers. One of them, this one, contains the bones of the main male occupant. And he is really affluent. What does he have? Faience beads, round beads including gold foil, amethyst signet scarab, and golden ring, golden bracelet, intact silver bracelet. Okay, see the money? They're wealthy. The Bible describes the generation of the lifetime of Jacob's descendants, describes them as becoming abundantly wealthy. And this is the kind of thing we'd expect to see. But with one of these, in fact, it's this number 3, the amethyst signet, amethyst scarab and golden ring. It was found right here. This one gives us hieroglyphics, which I read. This is a really exciting, fantastic discovery. Because the hieroglyphs read, and part of it's broken off, but we can restore what was missing from what actually appears down in Sinai as part of the inscriptions that are composed there when they're doing their turquoise expeditions. So what it reads is, Cheka, it's right here in transliterated hieroglyphics, Cheka en rechenu di sobek emchat. So, and there's my, to see it a little better, that's my electronic drawing of it. So the ruler of Rechenu, what does that mean? That's a title. Ruler means, in this case, the equivalent we would have in our culture is mayor. He's the mayor of the city of Avaris, okay? In the second occupational phase. So that's, oh, and then the of Rechenu. And I forgot to show you this earlier when I was there, but the coastline going up into Canaan from Egypt, remember I told you about the Levant? The whole area of the Levant, there's an Egyptian word that's used of that, and it's constantly in the Egyptian texts when they refer to people from this place. It's not the word, or the equivalent of Levantine, it's Rechenu. That's their word. Rechenu people are people from the Levant. Maybe the southern Levant, that later we know as Israel. Maybe it's Phoenicia. Maybe it's Syria. But it's that whole area. So this doesn't mean that he ruled in the Levant. It means he's a ruler who descended from people who came from Rechenu, from the Levant. All right, so that's his title. He's the mayor of Rechenu. And Rechenu there in this context, again, contextually, is the Asiatic enclave there at biblical Ramses, known to us as Avaris. All right, Di Sobek Amhat, what is that? It's a name. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Again, I'm submitting to you that this is Ephraim. We'll come back. Serbit Achadim, we talked about that before, where they do the turquoise mining. There's a picture of it. It's desolate. It was one of the hardest places I've ever been. And I've been to some rough places. I lived in Siberia for 10 years, okay? This is rough. Hard to live there. In the Middle Kingdom, Joseph's day, they built a series of religious buildings of religious connection. And they worshipped a deity there. It's the deity I told you about the first hour. Hathor. Remember Hathor? The female deity that in the Levant we know of her as Asherah, the female goddess that the Israelites go after, besides Baal, the male, her husband. So there's a temple built to Hathor there at Serbit. This is to show you there was actual mining there that took place, so they would burrow with their picks into the stone and find turquoise. Look, what do you see here? Anybody notice this? Pick marks. Those are with axes. They're pick marks from when they were chipping away at the stone to start going deeper into the hill. So here, remember I told you about these stelae that are 8 to 9 feet high. They look like tombstones. These give an account of a year's annual or whatever expedition to extract the turquoise. So at the bottom of Sinai 1:12, I referred to Sinai 1:15 before, the Hebrews inscription. This gives you a donkey, a man seated on a donkey, a young man behind him, and you can't see it too well here, but a young man in front. There's a caption right there. So this line is the bottom and last line of the description of that year's expedition as it goes down the stela. So it ends right here. That's where it ends. Here, this is a caption that goes with the picture. Here it is right here for you in drawn form. Sen en cheka en Rechenu Chebededem. What does that mean? Sen-en, son of Hekah, the ruler of Rechenu Chebeded, or Chebededem. That's the last M is my nation. It's kind of like an optional M that you can add at the end of the word or take it away. But it gives us a title and a name. Title, brother of the ruler of Rechenu. And you say, well, wait a minute. At Avaris, we had the ruler of Rechenu. He was buried there. Who's this guy? This is his literal physical brother. Now, if they both have this title, who is higher than the other? The ruler of Rechenu or the brother of the ruler of Rechenu? The ruler's higher. So he's the one who's the mayor. The other guy only has a title in reference to his brother. He has to be subservient. He has to be less than the brother. So, this brother of the ruler of Rechenu, his name is Chebeded. I looked in the Onomastica, the books that tell us all the names of the people of ancient Egypt. I looked for the name Chebeded and never found it anywhere. Only here in all of Egyptian history do we have the name Chebeded. And then I had to figure out grammatically, what is this? So I worked with it and figured it out. It is a perfect, meaning complete. It is a perfect passive participle. Doesn't that bless you? Perfect passive participle. It means, here's the important part. It means he who was disfavored. When Jacob was about to die, right? And Joseph took his two sons on that trip to visit him. And it was time to give the birthright blessing to one of them. Joseph expected the birthright blessing would go to whom? Manasseh, the oldest. He gets it. He's the oldest. So, but what does Jacob do? He does this job. Boop. Puts his right hand on the younger of the two. And Joseph stops him and says, Dad, you got it all wrong. This is the older one. Put your right hand on him and give him the birthright. What does Jacob say? To paraphrase, yes, my son, he will be great, meaning Manasseh, but his brother will be greater. Wow. There it is. What happened to Manasseh? Favor was taken away from him. What's this guy's name? He who was disfavored. That's Manasseh. So, think of this. Ephraim is back home in air conditioning at Avaris. Feed up, being fed grapes, right? Manasseh is stuck to go on this trail down into the desert to do the dirty work to get the turquoise. Doesn't sound good, does it, for the older brother? He is literally sitting in disfavor. That's his name. Why? As I told you before, in the ancient world, the naming of a person is when something distinguished him. This was a distinguishing moment in Manasseh's life. Favor was taken away from him. All right, so a lot more I wanted to show you. I kind of ran out of time, but we'll stop there. Thank you very much.